If you have ever thought about starting your own podcast, you should check out Riverside. Riverside is an online recording studio that lets you record podcasts and video in studio quality from anywhere. And if you click on the affiliated link in the episode description and you buy a subscription, you will also be supporting the podcast. And if you're going to start your own podcast or you just want to continue to listen to great podcasts, you need headphones or speakers. If you click on the Amazon affiliated link, you can get great deals on headphones and speakers. And if you make a purchase, it will also help support the podcast. Both links will be in the episode description if you are interested. When I say there were many times throughout history when witch hysteria was out of control, I mean it. People accused people they knew their whole lives. Blood turned against blood. Sometimes you didn't know who to trust, including yourself. Hi, my name is Courtney Jewell, and you are listening to the 10th episode of the second season of History Shelf, a podcast about history that proves that sometimes fact is even more interesting than fiction. For the second season of History Shelf, I have chosen to title this season Something Wicked This Way Comes. You may know that comes from the William Shakespeare play Macbeth. I am going to be talking each week this season about someone from history that was accused of witchcraft. But as we go along, you will find that the wicked I am referring to were not the ones that were accused, but rather the accusers. You will find that those accused were not obviously actually witches, but victims of people that were out for revenge and personal gain, and those caught up in the hysteria of it all. And for this week, I am talking about John Middleton. Before I get started on John Middleton's story, I just wanted to say that this episode will be a little bit shorter than normal. It will be a tad bit longer than the episode that I did on Elizabeth Barton last season. When I started this podcast, I didn't want to give myself any time restrictions, meaning I didn't want to not do an episode on a person because I knew that their episode would be long, but that also meant that I didn't want to not do an episode on a person that I knew that their episode would be short. That's why I have an almost hour-long episode on Queen Elizabeth I and a less than 10-minute episode on Elizabeth Barton. Most of the episodes that I have done this season have been shorter than last season, but I covered some pretty famous people last season. Most people are not born into or marry into royalty or have some huge impact that changes the world, but that doesn't make their story any less important or any less interesting. Going forward, there will be some seasons like last season, and some like this season. So without further ado, let's get started on John's story. Here is what we know about John. John was a planter in Bermuda. We also know that he had a wife named Elizabeth. We know this because this story actually starts with Elizabeth. Elizabeth was accused of being a witch in 1652. Now, as you may know, I have already covered a few people from the 17th century that were accused of being a witch. Witchcraft accusations were a common thing during this time, but they were a rare thing for Bermuda. Bermuda didn't prosecute witches like Europe had been doing. But things changed in 1652 when Hosius Forster was appointed governor. Hosius was a Puritan zealot. That's right, we have another story this season that contains a religious zealot. He may be the worst one that we have seen yet this season. All of Bermuda's witch trials happened in the 6 years he was in power. Hosius ruled with an iron fist. Before he came to Bermuda, Bermuda was angry over the execution of King Charles I. Oliver Cromwell's parliament had declared the entire colony in rebellion. Hosius brought with him a campaign of moral reform. and this led to a witch hunt. On December 7th, 1652, Elizabeth was brought before the court. She had been accused of witchcraft. It was believed in September of 1652 she had cursed a 9-month-old baby of Anthony White. After she allegedly cursed this baby, it went into strange fits. The court believed the charge to be ridiculous. Elizabeth got off, but some damage had been done when she was arrested. While she was arrested, she said that if there was a witch in Bermuda, it was likely her husband. And who says romance is dead? The exact date isn't known, but by 1563, John was arrested for bewitching an employee of Hosius named John McCarriton. John Middleton had been overheard threatening John McCarriton. After he was threatened, John McCarriton fell into fits and he had to be restrained. John McCarriton said that he was being pursued by a devilish black creature that had been conjured up by John Middleton. He said that this creature would periodically sit on him, and it would ask him if he would ever love him. John McCarriton said that he would tell him no. On April 17, 1653, Robert Priestley backed up John McCarriton's claim, saying that he had seen the devilish black creature. Robert said that he saw the creature lying near John Middleton's house. The creature looked like a cat, but it was much bigger. Its eyes were like fire, and its tail was as big as a man's arm. Robert said that he approached the cat-like figure and was going to stab it, but he suddenly didn't have the power to. He said that he ran from it, and when he looked back, the creature turned his head and looked at him wishfully, but Robert ran away. John Middleton was taken to prison. John McCarriton was also taken to prison for his protection. A detainee that was in the same room as John McCarriton, a man by the name of Simon Attain, said that one night, through a hole, he saw a black thing move so fast that he could not tell what shape it was. He said that the black thing came out of the privy hole. This did not help John Middleton. Hosius had 6 men look for a witch's cheat on John Middleton. I talked about in the episode I did on Agnes Sampson that her body was searched for a witch's mark. Again, a witch's mark could have been a mole or a birthmark. It could also have been a wart, freckle, supernumerary nipple, or any kind of blemish. When John's body was examined, a witch's mark was found. John was then dunked into water. This was a common thing to do in the 17th century when they were trying to determine if someone was a witch or not. If you've ever watched Monty Python and the Holy Grail, I'm sure the duck scene is running through your mind right now. But in real life, they didn't weigh suspected witches to see if they weighed the same as a duck. The theory was if you floated in the water, then that meant that you renounced baptism, and you were working for the devil and you were a witch. If you sank, then you were not a witch, but that also meant that you drowned. But hey, at least you weren't a witch. When they did this to John, he floated. When John was arrested, he swore that he was not a witch. After he was dunked into the water, he was returned to the prison and he was questioned. He confessed to be a witch then, but he said that he did not know that he was a witch before he was dunked into the water. A jury of 12 men found John guilty of witchcraft. John was sentenced to be hanged. On May 9, 1653, John was led to the gallows, but before his execution, he thanked everyone that informed him that he had become a witch. And that was the life of John Middleton. Thank you so much for listening to the 10th episode of the 2nd season of History Shelf. There are 15 episodes planned for this season. Next week's episode is going to be about Britta Zapel. I hope you come back for that. A few things before we go. If you want to follow this podcast on social media, the Twitter is at HistoryShelfPod. The Instagram is at History_Shelf_pod. The Facebook page is History Shelf Podcast. And the TikTok is History Shelf. If you want to help out this podcast financially, you can do that a few ways. You can buy merch from the History Shelf merch store. I will leave a link to the merch store in the episode description. You can also become a Patreon. This podcast is always going to be free, but there are some perks that come along with becoming a Patreon. The first tier is called History Student, and that is $1 a month. And with that, I will send out a thank you to you on social media. The second tier is called History Fan, and that is $3 a month. And with that, you get the first tier. Plus, you get to vote in a poll that helps me choose the theme for the next season of this podcast. The third tier is called History Buff, and that is $20 a month. And with that, you get the first 2 tiers. Plus, you will get a handwritten note of thanks mailed to you from me. The last tier is called History Lover, and that is $40 a month. And with that, you get the first 3 tiers. Plus, you get to choose one item from the History Shelf merch store. I will leave a link to the Patreon in the episode description if you are interested. Also, if you click on any of the affiliated links, there's one for Riverside and there's one for Amazon. If you click on any of those and you buy anything, that also helps support the podcast. Also, if you want to advertise anything on this podcast, if you have a podcast or a book or anything, a YouTube channel, I have started a gig on Fiverr, and I will leave a link to that gig in the episode description. But if you don't want any of the merch, and you don't want any of the perks, and you don't want to buy anything, but you still want to help support this podcast financially, I have turned on listener support on Spotify for podcasters. But as always, the best way that you can support this podcast is to continue to listen to it. And there are a few other ways that you can help out this podcast for free. One is if you are listening on a platform that lets you rate this podcast 5 stars and or leave a positive review. If you do that, that would be very helpful. Also, sharing this podcast on social media and telling your friends and family that you found a podcast that you enjoy and you think that they will enjoy will also be very helpful. Alright, well, until next time, keep learning, keep loving history, and come back for next week's episode. Bye.